All right, here we go. Flying solo today with today's live. We're going to be talking about the costs of training. So we'll give everybody a couple minutes to sign on and then we will get started. I am flying solo today because my partner in crime, Mike Perry, is getting some much needed family time today. So he's away for the weekend, so I'll be doing this one solo. And this is a portion of our course called the Principles of Program Design, and a section of it that we call the cost of training, that I go through various things that need to be considered when we go ahead and look at making decisions in terms of exercise programming. And so we're going to break down all of those different costs. And when I say cost, I'm not referring to how much it costs for your gym membership or how much a personal training session costs. And what we're referring to is that everything that we do physically, physiologically, is going to have some sort of expense. Okay, so we'll break down those expenses, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. And we have these wonderful, robust systems that are called the human body that can dynamically adapt to different environments, and that's how we've survived as a species for millions of years, is that we have these adaptive mechanisms, whether it's our autonomic nervous system that allows us to elevate our heart rate or blood pressure in times of stress, or whether it's just the mechanisms to adjust to temperature, where if it's hot, we sweat to cool down, or if it's cold, we shiver to warm up. All of these mechanisms kind of keep us in checks and balances. And so with that, everybody has a certain budget. And if you've been following along, you'll notice that there's a series of posts that we've been doing each week that go into certain themes. And so last week we talked about mobility. Next week, Mike and I are going to be talking about training for fat loss. And so our posts this week are breaking down each of the different elements, but we started off with talking about having a budget, right? So everybody has a physiological budget for their each given day. And that budget will vary depending on the day, and here's some of the reasons why it'll vary. What gives you a budget of how robust or how resilient you are things like big rocks, such as sleep, such as stress, whether it's physical or psychological stress, your nutrition level. All of those things put you in a position where you can either you could be better or worse at absorbing and handling stress. And so because of that, you basically have set up for yourself, your personal environment is set up to where you have a certain budget that is allowable for that given day. Now, there's different ways in which we can measure that budget, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the physiological cost of training. But imagine that you wake up every day and you have this budget that is afforded to you that you can spend, and we can expend that on different activities, okay? And so with that, the cool thing about the human body is that the more we push up against the edges of this, the better it gets at being resilient, the better it gets at bouncing back. And so that's part of the reason why training works, is that if you challenge yourself, your body goes, oh my gosh, I don't know what you just did. But if you're going to keep doing that, I have to be better able at responding to that more efficiently. If not, we're probably not going to survive, because even though our cells are living in 2022, they don't know that. These cellular mechanisms were created a long time ago, when we didn't have all the things available to us that we have now. And so let's start kind of breaking down what some of those costs are. Well, the first cost we have that we don't consider enough is the chronological cost of training. So we're going to start an exercise program. First question is, how much is this going to take in terms of my time? Because one of the sections we have in our course is called the key questions. And these key questions are questions that we ask every client the first time in the door to establish some rapport and some guidelines and to find out more about them. And when we ask them, what do you think is one of your biggest obstacles that could hold you back from success? Almost always the first answer is time, right? And it doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter if it's the high school kid who plays 2 or 3 sports, if it's the working professional who's working 50, 60 hours a week and trying to manage their family, or the parent who has to go to soccer practice and dance recitals and all these different things. No one has ever walked in and said, look, I have all the time in the world. And even if it's a professional athletes have business and personal obligations as well. And so, we joke in the course, it would be great if this was, old school, Olympic training where we just put our athletes in a cabin. We woke you up when we wanted to wake you up. We made you train. We fed you what you wanted to eat. We probably snuck in a little steroids back then. But then we also told you to go back to bed, go in your cabin, and we'll tell you when we're ready for you again. That's not real life. And so with that, we have to look at the chronological cost. So we could put together the greatest 4-day training split in the world. It doesn't matter if your client can only train 2 days a week for 45 minutes. So the art is figuring out how to make the most out of that 45 minutes and use that budget that we have wisely within that 45 minutes. So when someone asks if any of you as a professional, as I'm sure you got in the question, is this good? Is Pilates good? Or biceps curls good? Or any of these things good? It's not that they're necessarily good or bad. It's just a matter of we only have so much time. And if I handed you a sheet of paper right now and said write down everything that's good for you, you'll need another sheet of paper pretty quickly. The thing is what do I have time for that's going to be the key things, the main priorities that we have to focus on. So the chronological cost is something that's incredibly important, that if I'm going to invest this time, I need to make sure that it's worthwhile. So an example with that in our exercise world is let's look at cardiovascular training. Cardiovascular training, we have on one end, we have things like Tabata and HIIT training. And Tabata has been kind of bastardized from where it came from. Dr. Tabata came up with this system where he did extremely high intense exercise for bouts of 20 seconds with only a 10-second recovery, and it was 8 rounds. But that was it. It wasn't a half-hour class. It wasn't a 3-day-a-week program. It was this, but what he found was some pretty remarkable cardiovascular benefits. And so people started gravitating towards that and saying, well, why would I spend a half hour doing cardio when I can get it done in 4 minutes, right? The old joke about, 6-minute abs. But here's the thing, is that what are you doing in those 4 minutes? Are you doing burpees? Are you sprinting? Are you doing some sort of activity that is going to have a cost other than just physiological and metabolic cost? Realize that if you're going to sprint and you don't have the physiological reserves to do that, or if you're going to sprint and the next day you're expected to do something in your training that's also going to be intense, that you're robbing from tomorrow to get to what you want to get to today, and we can't do that. And so there was actually a great meta review, and I think it was Brad Schoenfield who does some great work looking at the difference in terms of weight loss, fat loss, looking at HIIT training versus traditional steady state training. And when you equal out the calories, they're pretty much the same. So the question is, what do I have time for? If I'm in a situation, in a pinch, and I have the reserve and all my other things in my budget that allows me to do that HIIT program, then by all means, that's a great way to get more done in less time. But if you only have the structural capacity, the physiological capacity to go for a light jog or walk, well, that HIIT's not on the table. That's not an option for you. So that's kind of where we look at chronological costs, but you can see all these costs kind of weave in with each other. So we're going to keep breaking down the costs. For those of you who just jumped on, we're breaking down the costs of training. If you have questions, just shoot it in the comments. I'm flying solo today since Mike, my partner in crime, is on a much needed break with the family. So if you have questions, you can kind of be my co-host here and ask all the questions you want. So we already talked about having your budget for the day and your chronological costs. Our next cost we look at that is incredibly unappreciated is the neurological cost. Realize that muscles are all driven by our nervous system, and how that works either consciously or subconsciously and reactively, it has this pretty significant cost. And a lot of even just our calories that we burn throughout the day are just for brain function. And so our nervous system does take a certain amount of energy. And also, obviously, the things that are more neurologically challenging are going to be things that require more focus and metabolic energy. So we want to put those type of things in terms of a micro setting, in terms of the workout itself. We want those things up front. So if I'm going to be doing explosive medicine ball throws or jumps or Olympic lifts or those types of things, I'm going to want to put those towards the front end of my workout, and then put what I'll call, for lack of a better term, the dumber exercises, like a floor dumbbell press or a bicep curl, stuff that doesn't require a whole lot of neurological challenge and not much skill. Put that stuff at the back end of your workout. Now, on a bigger scale, on a more macro scale, we have to look at the course of your week. So right now, I'm working with a lot of baseball players who are getting ready for their season, and for the pitchers, that means they're throwing live bullpens on a day like today. So I have a bunch of pitchers who are throwing live bullpens today. It's Friday. What that means is yesterday's workout, I can't do a whole bunch of explosive, really neurologically challenging stuff because they're going to be fried, and that's going to show up in their bullpen today. So I have to make sure I manage that budget, not just within today, but within the course of the week, and that we can only have so much neurological challenge. Now, the way I can explain that is you ever notice how you feel when you come out of taking a really hard exam, or if you've had to drive home in a really bad storm and it's like 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and you're white knuckling it the whole way home, that exhaustion that you get, or a really challenging day at work where you're working on projects, that's neurological fatigue that you're getting. And realize that is something that is significant, and it needs to be accounted for in your training budget of each day and in each week. Okay, so we've gone through chronological time, we've gone through neurological and the nervous system. Since we were talking about neurological, we touched on the brain. There's also a psychological component. Now, that's, again, all these things aren't necessarily a bad thing, but realize, as much as it is incredibly empowering to get someone to do their first push-up, first pull-up, to be able to, the first time a guy is able to put a big plate on the bar and bench press or some, seminal moments in their training. But at the same time, if they miss those, and their failures can also be very challenging. And so realize the psychological impact that you have. And when someone comes in and they realize, wow, I can't even do a chin-up, is getting this art of putting people to where they're successful but challenged at the edge of their ability is extremely important. Also understanding that psychological stressors will affect all the other systems. I was having this conversation yesterday with a client of mine who's preparing for a triathlon. And his weakest aspect of it, as it is with many, is his swim. And he said he tracks his heart rate when he swims, and he noticed that before he even started the swim, his heart rate went through the roof because it was his first big open swim. And and the apprehension that goes with that is incredibly impactful on all of the other physiological systems. Another example I give is they used to talk about when they would work with a lot of the old Eastern Bloc lifters, they would monitor their heart rate. And if they were to go to do an attempt and their heart rate raised a certain amount, it kind of meant they were getting amped up for that lift. They would pull them off the lift. They didn't want they didn't want them to proceed because what happens is if they even if they hit that mark and they get that weight, the cost it was going to take on the rest of that week of training, and they had things mapped out, for a 4-year plan to go to the Olympics, they couldn't afford what that was going to be. It's kind of like energy on credit, right? So you see those shoes or that jacket you like in the mall and you really like it, but you don't have that money in the budget. It's going to have to come from somewhere, and someday that bill is going to come. And so managing that budget is important. And so the psychological factors are important to consider. The other way I also describe this is for any of you that ever played football. We would go through practice Monday through Thursday and do way more contact and way more physicality and reps through those 4 days and wake up and not really think much about it than you would on a Friday night game where you'd play maybe 20, 30 plays, but you'd wake up Saturday morning like you got hit by a truck because of that psychological factor that you were going to go beyond, and sometimes you'll go beyond that 100%. And so that is extremely taxing. And so factoring that in, that's how we start to look at things in terms of when people are competing, and whether it's the local 5K or it's pitching in a game or playing in a high school game on a Friday night. We have to consider that. And then also for our athletes in season, how do we work in getting them more prepared both day of game and day after game in terms of managing stressors. So now that we've gone through psychological, let's look at physiological. And how do we measure that, our current physiological state? Well, there's a lot of stuff out there that's become more consumer friendly. I have an Oura ring, I have a Morpheus strap. I've tried the Whoop band. I've tried a lot of the different HRV devices that look at heart rate variability, and that's gradually becoming a gold standard for kind of your current physiological state and looking at things. It is not a end-all be-all where you should just judge your day based on what your Whoop readiness score tells you. But that does give you some insight. It gives you some insight because you'll see it's kind of a total of a lot of the different things that I'll notice that if I ate a little too late before I went to bed, or if I happened to have a drink or two last night, or I didn't get enough sleep, or I'm super stressed. Those things show up in your HRV, and that gives you a little bit of a gauge in your fuel tank of where you're at physiologically. So that's just one aspect. As you look at your HRV and you look at all the things that come into play with that, is your sleep, is your mental stress, your any kind of physical stress. Sleep is an incredibly impactful thing with that. Your nutrition, your hydration, all those things are going to affect your current physiology. And so because of that, now when we look to program our workouts, we have to then base it on your current physiological state. And I love what Joel Jamieson is doing with the Morpheus strap. And it's something I've used for a couple of years now, where he's going to put your training zones up or down based on where you're at physiologically and your recovery score. So it's not just the same, here's my target heart rate, whether I went on an all-night bender or whether I slept 10 hours and ate like an angel. So we have to kind of look at where I'm at with our training, so we can bias that based on that physiological budget. Okay. Next is your metabolic cost, and this is actually another one that could be a really good thing. Obviously, if you're trying to lose weight or lose body fat, we want to have as much metabolic cost to the exercise as possible, right? So if I can burn more calories, that's probably a good thing. But realize that, number one, it doesn't matter if you're not in a net deficit at the end of the day. So if we argue and you see things, these little infographics online that tell you that this exercise burns more calories than this exercise, or this activity burns more than this activity, that could be right, but understand that that's unique for each individual. Did you ever notice if you could put on a treadmill and then walk away, it still tells you that you burned 100 calories. You also have to factor in, at the end of the day, if there's not a net deficit, meaning you didn't still burn more than you took in, it didn't really matter whether you chose the elliptical, a rowing machine, or sprinting as far as what burned more calories in that instant, because at the end of the day, it's about having that net deficit. Now, that being said, we also have to look at what's the greatest metabolic cost and greatest metabolic expenditure I can get if my goal is fat loss, while also considering all those other factors. So the post that I'm going to put up today tells a story about and this will lead into our last cost. It tells a story about a Division I lineman that I have, who he went to one of his prospect camps, and the coach there said, "Look, we love you, but you need to lose weight." And he did. He was probably 340 pounds, and it wasn't a chiseled 340. Let's just say that. And so with that, he said, "You need to start running." And thankfully, he checked with me first. And this is a kid whose ankles almost touch the ground when he runs. His knees almost rub together. He's 340 pounds. If you just see him, running onto the field after, to come on for an offensive series, you cringe, let alone, letting that kid go out and get on a track and run a couple miles. Now, imagine he does do that, and he suffers through that discomfort that he's going to have, because it's going to be inevitable. Is it going to burn some calories? Sure. But is he going to now show up, in a couple weeks with some knee pain or some hip pain or some low back pain? There's probably a good chance of that. Now, did I say that running is bad? No. Did I say that he should never run? No. But I'm saying it's not the best decision for him. So when we look at the last cost, and this is I save it for last because this has become an incredibly hotly debated topic, and I can't understand why, is the concept of a structural cost or orthopedic cost. Now, orthopedic cost is a term that I steal from Coach Mike Boyle, and if you're not familiar with his work, you need to be. Okay, Coach Boyle put out a post a couple weeks back talking about the orthopedic cost of exercise, and got tons of blowback. And I've looked at all the arguments against, and I don't understand why. There is a structural cost to exercise, right? So if I have someone who's coming off a Tommy John injury, and I have them go out and start whipping weighted balls a month after surgery, why would I not do that? Because there's going to be a structural cost. That tissue is not ready to be adaptable to that type of strain. So just common sense, right? So how is that any different than me telling this young man not to go out for a run, or you, when you sit down and write an exercise program, that why you would choose a step up versus a lunge, or one type of squat versus another, or a floor press versus a barbell bench press? It's just a matter of weighing risk versus reward. And so I have to look at what I can get the greatest expenditure, right? That of building of metabolic cost if my goal is weight loss. What's going to get the greatest feedback from a neurological standpoint if my goal is strength and power? If my goal is to gain muscle, what's going to create the greatest formative change in terms of stimulating lean body mass gain? And how can I do that with the least structural cost? That seems to just make sense, and the fact that it was debatable is somewhat crazy to me, but that is something that is has been debated, believe it or not, in terms of structural cost. So before we wrap up, again, if you have any questions, just throw them in the comments. We'd love to answer any before we go. For those of you who joined us, thanks for jumping on. Mike is not with me this weekend. He'll be back next week, and we're going to talk about the training for fat loss and how we go about that. I'll talk about it with him with regular fitness goals versus performance goals and how that factors in, looking at how you do that with working with individuals as well as working and doing that in a group setting. So wrapping up costs of training, we have this budget each day that you decide the budget. Okay, so the analogy that I give the clients on day one is that we are looking to grow, okay, this thing that is the future you, okay? And so the training program is just going to be the seeds, right? You are the soil, and you're going to determine how well that soil is in terms of how fertile it is based on what happens the other 23 hours a day, okay? So if I plant seeds on my hardwood floor, they're not going to grow, right? But if I plant it in good fertile soil, then there's a good chance that it's going to flourish. And what's the difference between the floor and the soil? Is in the analogy of the human body, that is your sleep, that is your nutrition, that is managing your stress, that is all of those other things that are going to allow that soil to be fertile. And so with that, it also is a matter of how well you manage this budget of your costs and realize that it is not a thing where it is linear, okay? Where it is every day I go at the same pace, at the same effort level, from now to eternity. And it is also not a linear progression in terms of strength. I had a kid yesterday who was in one of my high school weight rooms, and he saw that he was making this progression as he added weight. And I said, you realize, and he said, well, what do you think I'll get to? I said, well, we'll have to see, because it doesn't work where you always keep putting another 5 on every single week. Because if that was the case, I'd come back in the summer, you'd be bench pressing 600 pounds. Realize that you have this adaptable system, and that adaptable system, how well it's going to adapt and how resilient and robust you are, is going to be determined by those other, what I call 23-hour factors, or your sleep, your nutrition, your rest. But it's also determined by how well you can manage the art of getting right up against the edge of your budget. So if this is how much you have available today, how close can I get to here without going over? Now, there may be days that I actually intentionally go over. Let's say it's, perfect example, today's a Friday. Tomorrow you have nothing to do other than your laundry, maybe ordering some takeout, and you're going to watch a Netflix, right? And you have all day that you can maybe go for a light walk, you can do some recovery mobility work. You know what? I'm going to put the pedal down, and I may push it a little more, because you're going to have tomorrow as a reserve. So what you're going to see is this ebb and flow where it's high and low. And you can manage that if you want to put it pretty simply. I referred to Joel Jamieson earlier. He kind of talks about having 2, 2, and 2, where you can have 2 light days, 2 moderate days, 2 heavy days, or you can go, and vary those a little bit. But you can't just go 7 days a week pedal to the metal. You will burn out, and you will eventually get that bill that I referred to before. You can't just keep going to the mall and buying jewelry and buying shiny shoes when you don't have anything in the account. And each one of us has a little bit different in the account. The art of being a good trainer or coach is knowing how much your clients have in the account and being able to spend right up against it, because the more you can do that, the more you can get right to that edge, the more their budget bumps up. That's the cool thing, is that you don't have to save it. You don't want to go ahead and die with your communion money, stored in a shoebox. It doesn't work like that with exercise. If you just save your breaths and you save your emotion, your heartbeats, it's going to make you live longer. It's actually the opposite. You need to expend that in order to come back and be more robust. but you got to not overspend it. And if you do, you got to know, hey, I'm going to overspend a little because I know I got this paycheck coming in the next day, and that'll cover that. So being able to manage that budget is kind of how the art of all this works. So that is our little talk on the cost of training. Next week, as I said, Mike is back. We're going to talk about training for fat loss. We also have some other cool ones. We're going to talk about specific things where if you're working with someone with, or yourself, you're working with someone with low back restrictions and low back pain. If you're working with someone with shoulder restrictions, we're going to talk about some specific things with that. We have some one on Mike, obviously, is very skilled with the kettlebell, so we're going to talk about how you incorporate kettlebell training and where and how that fits in. And then other stuff on the front as far as our principles of program design stuff. If you're not following us, please do. We do post every single day on different topics, and then do our live every Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern. We have our online course that we're editing right now that will be released later in March. And then we have our first live course will be May 1st in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. We will have registration open for that in the next few weeks as well. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you back next week. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a direct message either to Mike or myself or in our PPD social media accounts. And please share with your friends and your colleagues. And if you have any ideas for future topics, please put it out there. We're here to help, and this is kind of our way of paying it forward after a lot of years in this industry and kind of sharing ideas and kind of pushing this thing along. So appreciate your time. Hope everybody enjoys the weekend. Thank you for joining us.